Welcome to episode 1 of series 2. I'm excited to announce that we're joined by Jon Hammant, leader at AWS and hugely knowledgeable on compute, technology, cloud, and of course, one of the main topics we're talking about today is AI and data. So let's dive in. Well, welcome, Jon. Thank you for coming on the show. I guess the first thing to do is really have a few intros and tell us a little bit about you. You work for AWS and you have a customer-facing role, but tell us what's in your day to day.
Yeah, definitely. So Jon Hammant. So I've been with AWS for about 4.5 years or so. Initially was running the compute business for the UK, then running the compute business for Europe, and now I lead the specialist business for the UK. So that's pretty broad in terms of scope. It's both business and commercial, which is relatively unique for a lot of these roles. And basically, I look after all of our core computing services. So that's everything from EC2 to networking to high performance computing to security. Our enterprise applications and modernization. So that's if you're thinking of moving more, I wouldn't say legacy, but more heritage workloads. Would be a nice way of putting it. Heritage workloads.
Very politically correct.
Yeah, it's important. So the heritage workloads that you want to move over, whether that's either Windows or VMware or SAP or anything that contains in serverless, so I lead that. And then also there's the really fun bit that I look after, so all of our data, AI, storage, and analytics businesses.
Yeah,
so we're pretty.
Well, that's certainly part of the appeal of having you on. I tend to. So I've been doing these, a whole season now. We're into season 2, and every episode I've brought up AI, and we've had a bit of a chat. It's very relevant to data, of course, but it doesn't usually come up in the first 5 minutes or even in the introduction. So if you take us back to the kind of compute and the kind of work that Amazon does and the kind of infrastructure you help customers with, it feels like AI is in a very similar trend to early computing, cloud computing, where adoption is kind of ahead of controls.
Yeah.
I sort of wonder if you're seeing organizations start to panic as they adopt it more and have not quite figured out, the constraints. I know they're struggling on the delivery side to have enough compute for AI, but I wonder how it surfaces for the customers and what you see.
It's a super interesting topic. So I think there's a number. So I do think history kind of has a habit of repeating itself. And I think some of the things that we're seeing AI go through at the moment kind of remind me of the early days of the iPhone, if you remember, kind of back when that released into a business context. So, people talk about their jobs being removed by AI. I like to think my job has previously been removed by progress. So I used to be a BlackBerry administrator, a BES administrator.
Wow.
Kind of as lovely as a job that is, many, many moons ago. And, at the time, I thought BlackBerry, I still think BlackBerries are really cool. Like they were fantastic little email devices. And it was interesting because the iPhone kind of turned up. And all of a sudden, I think the reaction, I remember at the time, because I was working in Ladbrokes currently, the reaction was, oh my God, do not let people plug those in. Like that is a terrible thing. There's data leaks. There's all these issues that can happen with it. Yeah. And I think and at first, and that was a pushback for, a year or so you saw happen. And then you suddenly saw the kind of the enterprise readiness of them coming in very, very quickly, that people moved, they used through this and the admin tools that came in, they got a bit better. And all of a sudden then, you flip that. There's very few people who are using a BlackBerry for work now. They're all using iPhones, that makes sense. Or they're all Androids. Yeah. And I kind of think the same thing is happening with AI. So, it's come in that we've hit the zeitgeist of both, whether that's either Claude or ChatGPT or, DeepSeek now. You have so many people that are using this in their daily lives, whether that's either from working out cooking recipes to, helping plan a holiday to asking it to help them learn a language, whatever folk are doing. All of them. And I
heard on the radio the other day, there was a announcement, I think it was public sector, some more controls. I think they might have even banned its usage because they're worried about the data leaks.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel that that's probably one of the best barometers of its market penetration. Basically, even the public sector, even one of the industries that's sort of renowned for being behind the curve, is using this tech, and people are trying to innovate with it.
And the weird thing is, I think people are, everyone's using it. I think the reality is that a lot of companies are in this situation of going, well, how do we take advantage of it? Because the reality is, I can tell you categorically, if places ban it and they say, thou shalt not use generative AI to do things, 100% people are sitting there and they're using it on their phone, or they're just using it anyway. So we talked to a CIO of a large organization recently, and he was saying that they see on their web proxy effectively the amount of usage of unauthorized tooling that's going on. It's bonkers. So what do I think? So we kind of that's for a while. I do think a lot of companies have realized that actually them spinning up their own internal agents is a really, really useful thing. So we've got it internally. So we've got something called Cedric that basically we use for pretty much everything. It's fantastic. It's got the Amazon docs within it. It's got loads of context. It's all secure. It's all internal. So I think in terms of that maturity life sale at the moment, most companies that aren't running some kind of internal invocation of an LLM that are of any size, realistically, will either be looking at team packages on some of the good external ones, or they're going to be working out how they kind of integrate their own. I think the value is really when you put your business data into it as well.
And I definitely, it's probably my own personal perspective and talking to clients and thinking about how to get real value from it. What I notice is that everyone tends to be naming them. So they all kind of like creating them like their pets, or they're kind of like, and I think what's interesting about that to me is that once you start doing that and you start treating them personally and you start thinking, well, this is how Amazon does it. Well, of course you want to tune it even further. Of course you want to like make it, even sound like someone at Amazon talks, or someone in your company that uses their lingo. That seems like a real natural extension, or at least obvious from when they start naming them.
No, 100%. I think you can see. So we working with a very large advertising company at the moment, and they often talk about brand voice. So making sure that the thing speaks with the voice of your brand, and it's definitely something that we're seeing, especially for things that are public facing. If you go onto let's say for example, you go onto use a chatbot that comes with an alcohol company, compared to a chatbot that might come from a travel agent. Like, you want the thing to feel and interact differently. I do think in the longer term, like where I'm really excited about this, honestly, is I think getting to a point where I can have I'd really like an assistant. I think an assistant would be super good, especially one that knows everything, knows more than me and knows things around it.
Well, knows everything, right? That's sort of the appeal, is that every single scrap of information is available.
Yeah,
even the best assistant wasn't at that level.
And I think so for years we existed in a geocentric universe where people viewed that effectively everything orbited around the Earth. I think there was this for 1,000 years until Copernicus turned up, and there was this sudden realization that actually we're in a heliocentric thing. We're orbiting around the sun. It's all different. And I kind of think the evolution of intelligence is going to go through the same thing at the moment. Even you hear people talking about AI, they talk about it's artificial human level intelligence. So much of it's compared to humans. I think the really interesting opportunity for me is the kind of the extension of what intelligent means going into different directions. I think we're kind of getting that. I think some of the larger ML models at the moment, they just have a different kind of intelligence when you play around with it. It's fantastic.
I think that's an interesting measure of the progress. Obviously, there's tons of excitement about the models, and DeepSeek's announcement, disrupting the market, and a lot of really panic about where the value lies.
Yeah,
I suppose as a data company, and delivering technology to move information around.
Yeah,
my kind of heliocentric view was always that the data is the intelligence. There's a fine tuning of how you deliver it, speed you deliver it, the fidelity, there's how you get to it. But really, it's pointless unless you have the knowledge, unless you have an answer.
I think that, and I think you're going to see. So I do think there's going to be revolutions in the ISV SaaS side of things. I think when you think about what a lot of software does effectively, it's 3-tier architectures are still the architectures that mainly exist. I mean, they're microservice, but effectively you have data that's being stored somewhere. You do something with that data and you present it back to a user. I mean, that is a kind of a majority of things you do. I think it'll be really interesting when you go forward and you think all of a sudden, well, what is the interaction layer on all of this? Well, actually, do you even need the interaction layer? Does it just become, okay, you have raw data that's sitting there, you have an agent that knows how to work with it, knows how to work with different pieces? I think it's going to be interesting for some of these very large SaaS businesses that have made made a living off effectively that thin slicing, but the almost the intermediation that's been occurring for quite some time.
I actually think it's quite a interesting insight across all areas of software. So I think what you've described in my terminology is a system of record where you look after things, and then where you make decisions. You have analytics, or you have some kind of warehousing of that information downstream. The disruption, I agree, seems to be that there is no real need to input it in the future. It's just sensing, it's collecting, this is what's going on, and then you just have the output. Well, this is what was actually happening. That's kind of tended to be the weakness of many CRM systems, is that if nobody input it, it was a kind of pile of useless information. But you don't need someone to be painstakingly managing these things in the future.
I think that, and I think also, I really like XKCD. If you've watched that, the comics with the stick people.
Well, my son's an actual hero. He loves him.
It's just brilliant. But and there was one of them where they said about making a new charging standard. And they kind of had, right, here's 12 different chargers. We're going to make one new charging standard that's going to rule them all. And then what you end up with, 13 charging standards.
Of course you did.
And I think what we've it's interesting to see how AI is evolving. I think a lot of this that you're going to build, like, how do we use AI in a business? What you're going to do, a new tool that you're going to go to. So all you do is you're going to go, how are we going to streamline those other tools? We're going to build a new one over here, and you're going to go to it and use that one instead. I think very quickly that paradigm is going to shift. And actually what you're going to find, probably within, I'm seeing it more and more in places, that it's just going to become part of the workflow of what you do. Yeah. That is the reality of it. And I think
certainly in every product, there's we can see every vendor putting it in the product, and some better than others for sure. I wonder if you see and talk to data teams, and so there's kind of two angles I'd like to think about it from. Yeah. There's what the organization does, and the data team, I think, is a crucial part of supplying that capability to the organization. And then there's the data team themselves, like how they benefit. And I wonder if you're speaking to data teams and working with data teams. And
yeah, we really are. And I think there's so on the different lenses around that, I think if I look at where do I see some of the near-term implications of AI, I do see it in productivity on technical development or technical work. I think there really are some amazing options. It's fantastic. I code alongside with Claude now. It's just brilliant. It's like I've got a pair programmer who's far more capable than me and knows things better. And I can't necessarily always trust them, but most of the time they're pretty right. And as long as you kind of work out where they're going to go, you're kind of. So I think this whole idea of almost pair work with an AI, I think is going to come, and I think that will massively benefit some of the data teams. I think also it's interesting thinking what the schema format of the future is going to be. I think is a super interesting thing. So we were working with a very large meteorological association we work quite closely with, and we're talking through kind of different options, things we can do. And one of the bits of advice that we're giving to them is use more free text. So when they're storing files, when they're storing blobs of data, include just a human-written free text explanation of what that thing is. And it's kind of weird thinking that human free text would have been the thing that I would have made my toes curl if my
that's the most useless way of storing it, whereas it turns out to be the best.
It is it's really, and I think that more and more, so we've been looking at agents and how effectively how agents will communicate via APIs. I do think the API of the future will be natural language, and I think that's a really interesting change that just hasn't ever. And also, natural language has millions of years of evolution. We've designed to get good at saying things.
Yeah, and must be able to convey information accurately and at scale. It works. Yeah. It's been proven to work. One of our clients was dealing with information supplied to them from their customers. So they're actually in a private equity scene, and obviously you get delivered decks. You get given information. Sometimes you get the ability to tweak the forecasts, and there's macros and there's spreadsheets, and we were sort of wringing our hands and thinking, how do we deal with these macros and spreadsheets? Actually, I think fast forward a couple of years, and the supply will figure out that they better give it in an AI ready way, and then there's sort of no point in coming up with a technology to work out how to tweak a macro and build a formula out. Just people will supply it differently. They'll understand how to supply it differently.
100%. And I think I do think the way of working is going to change in the near future. I really do. And I think you're right on your earlier point about, I think the DeepSeek style moments, I think have been really impactful. I think finance has really started to wake up in terms of what's doing. I think one of the things that was, for me, was most interesting out of it happening was the move to using more reinforcement learning. And I think that from a technical perspective, I think it's super interesting that, for ages, so any large scale technology change is just a number of overlaid S curves. So you just stack S curves. That's where where that's everything from like lithography to, algorithmic development. It's just lots of S curves that are rolling over the top. I think what you've seen with AIML in the near term has been the S curves that have been Moore's law. So just taking advantage of that, and that's gone into pre-training. That's gone into some post-training with reinforcement learning with human feedback. That's gone into increasingly test time compute and pieces around that. I think now reinforcement learning and effectively self-play within these models is going to be really, really impactful, especially for areas that have defined answers. And that's I think the $1 trillion question for me is, are the LLMs getting or the AI systems, getting as good as they'll ever be in things like not psychology or in philosophy, for example, things that are less constructed and less constrained in terms of their outcome. But for things where there is an outcome, so for sciences, for maths, for a lot of that kind of area, you can show, and for finance being a perfect example, you can show an outcome that you desire from it. So is there a limit to how much you can effectively iterate internally to get to that point? And the answer is no one really knows where it's going to go. But you kind of argue whether it's synthetic data, and at what level does synthetic data can be useful to continue to move this forward. It's super
right. One of the things I see organizations grappling with, so obviously the technology's new, the infrastructure, the constraints, how people use it, sort of volume, which leads to some cost pressures perhaps. And one of our core value propositions is kind of lowering that cost of managing and looking after your data. But what I see, the other thing they're struggling with is the pace. So you're talking about some very specific opportunities and features around the technology, and I see people investing, customers investing a lot of their time currently just in trying to keep up and understand it and find the opportunities before you even get to leveraging it or getting an outcome.
Yeah.
And it must be quite worrying, or at least frustrating for a kind of senior leadership team to think, okay, disruption might be coming from this. How do we spend our time and our money? And that the outcomes aren't obvious. It's sort of, to some extent, it was easy in the kind of mobile era. Well, you need a mobile app, or you need a surface for the customer. This is not so obvious yet.
I think that, and I think there's a strange dichotomy that exists at the moment that I can almost, I was just like shooting stars. I always feel like they had a dove from above in this show, and there was View AI has been this like dove from above. You coo this thing down, and I think it's amazing that I can effectively summon up PhD level intelligence to go and do some really, really, really ultra clever things.
Yeah.
Yet still, for me to put together my expense, I've got loads of expenses that I haven't done, and that is going to be a 3-hour slog of comparing receipts.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. I think there's so many bits where I think we are kind of getting towards that turning point that I think we start to see large scale impact. I think we're on the edge. I don't think we've had that kind of true aha moment of implementation yet.
No, I think in certain use cases, people are like, okay, well that's a perfect one to use it. That should be available. I think within teams that I deal with, it's still not that obvious. So, give you a couple of examples. I think the early notion was, well, let's write SQL better. Let's write queries. Maybe the developer tool, the kind of assistant to development. And actually, I think then there's sort of a growing realization that well, one of the most demanding things on the team's time, which is fundamentally where all the cost comes from, majority of the cost and sort of where the opportunities lie, both servicing their customers better, their internal customers, is that they answer a lot of questions. They dig into a lot of things. And there was always this kind of self-service, analytics type dream, or people self-servicing. Actually, like the tool used by someone, or the tool used by the person who has the need, there's going to be tons of time saved there, and actually real organizational context, asking things about the organization. I think less so in the truly nuanced kind of predictive side that the opportunity seemed to initially be.
I think also there has to be an ask as to what metric are you trying to optimize for. So I do think there's almost like the whole pay-per-click maximizer view of AI going wrong, because eventually this thing gets told to make some paperclips, it does, and it decides to take over all of humanity to continue to make paperclips. I think there's a more micro worry that can happen where you start thinking, so AI is very good at certain things, very good at writing lots of documents. And so, we could sit down and we could make a huge cornucopia of documents for people to go and read. But realistically, that has no business outcome. That's not what any customers want. I think and it's the same. We see it in development a bit. So we've got a few customers that have effectively bought in AI-driven development. That's definitely something that's coming, and something that I'm really passionate about. I think really makes a difference. A few of them, their initial impact and the initial assessment hasn't necessarily always been as good, because one of the worries is if you give a load of sometimes more in the junior side of development, and I think it's just you end up with a lot of maybe something more junior developers who write lots and lots and lots and lots of code that isn't very good, and you kind of isn't really useful to an extent. Like the best line of code is one that you don't write, and I think it's interesting when you come up with a system that's very, very good at generating large quantities of things that humans have to deal with. I think on the flip side, in terms of companies that are effectively going on to this, I think you'll see some companies waste a lot of time by getting AI to write a lot of things for them that a lot of people take to read without any benefit for it. So
I totally agree. In fact, where our mind goes almost instantly from that is, there's a sort of deluge of dashboards that's sort of constantly lamented by our customers and our kind of industry. But obviously, you could create dashboards a lot faster. Doesn't make them any more useful.
I mean, it's interesting. I used to work with the data warehousing team quite early in my career, and even then, I think there were, everything. If you're going to make a dashboard, if you're going to look at analytics, what's the business value? What's the outcome that thing drives? If you're just going to show stuff that doesn't really, and also it needs to, when you think about going through all these from a data perspective, stuff needs to be actionable. If you're just looking at something and going, that's kind of nice to see, who cares? Like, it's just there's no, like, it's, and so I think you're kind of exactly spot on. I think the ability to create vast amounts of dashboards is going to be an interesting tool. I think also there's definitely, I've seen in the world of business, sometimes people blame the lack of dashboards and view on things as being the reason we can't do this is because we don't have a dashboard that does it. And actually, I feel sometimes that maybe isn't the underlying why that is sitting there.
Yeah, exactly. It never was. It's I guess as an emerging space, there is a race to figure out how to use it, and that's probably hard to get away from. And one of the things that I challenge a few guests with is why the the cursors, why the kind of developer tools might have ended up being the first place. And to me, it's because it's explainable. You're developing something, and we've just sort of touched on the point of it's not necessarily a high quality thing, but it's helping develop something explainable. I wonder if, like, thinking about all the different customers and things you see customers doing, like, do you think the trend will be more that way? So more creating something else that's understandable, or more autonomous and more intelligence of itself?
Yeah, I think it's really so. In terms of the trends we see, I think this year you will see far more developed. It will just become a default in the same way that CI/CD became a kind of default. I mean, it's interesting looking back at when I was first working at Accenture doing DevOps, and you can talk to people about DevOps, and people are like, "Oh, I don't know what that is. That's a like continuously integrate. Why would we? Surely we want to like test it and then now we're in a situation where most developers will basically have a workflow. They'll push it to Git, it'll go off and it'll do stuff and it'll roll out ideally into it. So I think we're kind of in the same situation now, but with AI. So I think in probably a year from now, there will be a default that if you're coding, you're using it for some kind of smart autocomplete, using some kind of research around it. I think it's very, very much seeing people using it for testing. I think that's one of the areas that we would recommend going for first. If you're going to write things with AI, actually writing the test harnesses is probably more valuable because it's very good at generating tests. As to why it's happening, I mean, it's kind of, if you imagine what's happening behind it, it's really interesting thinking of how babies learn. So like it's really cool when you see. So I've got like 3 kids. It was just like a little science project, seeing the things like work out what's going on. And if you think like a baby will put its foot in its mouth, for example, when it's really small, and I think what's it doing? Well, it's using reinforcement learning, so it's calibrating effectively using the most sensitive area that it has in its body, so its mouth, and it's using that to calibrate the other sensations within its body, and so it learns through. You know, it keeps walking, it keeps going through. The reason why I think there's probably going to be an increasing acceleration in the use of AI within things like development and technical fields is because it's really, really easy to self-play. Like that's the kind of interesting thing. And fundamentally, if you think, how does intelligence comes from two ways. So intelligence either comes from learning from something else, so that kind of like knowledge and effectively knowledge transfer, or it comes from self-play. And actually, when we look in terms of history, so, you know, if you get the big things that happened, so if you go back to AlphaGo and AlphaZero, it was really interesting seeing the work that went into that. And the real aha moments actually started to come from AlphaZero, where it was all reinforcement, all like
just discovering completely new ways. Actually, though, I don't know, I'm fairly into chess, right? Like playing online chess. You know, some of these strategies, you know, a lot of excitement in those early sort of reinforcement learning type approaches is that, well, this is a strategy no one had yet discovered through all of the humanity, and chess is a game that's quite good at documenting outcomes and patterns and making recommendations, and yet it's discovering new things. And I think probably there's still an unsolved challenge of how you get the learning back in. You know, testing is one thing. You can't necessarily test on an organization buying companies, for example, or investing in.
One of the other things that I lead that's probably most exciting is our high performance computing side of things. I think that for me is like just super, super interesting in terms of everything from drug discovery to computational fluid dynamics to like it's just a really interesting helping science is kind of why I like doing it. I think it's interesting when you look back at how science works. It's so much luck driven. Like it really is. When you look at like large, like you take stainless steel, for example. So it was pure luck that we discovered stainless steel. We weren't looking for it. We didn't specifically go after it. We didn't think anything with the qualities that have it even existed. It was just literally through a British scientist basically looking for new shell casings, trying loads in a row, and then finding one that he thought had failed because it didn't even have the qualities that he wanted it to have. And then suddenly working out that we've created this fantastic new material that means effectively that you can eat with a fork, but I don't taste it. There's no reason that it happened when it did. It could have happened much earlier, and equally, it probably could have happened a fair bit later. I think what really excites me about computing at the moment is we're kind of on the spiky exponential side of Moore's law at the moment. That like exponential change is everyone kind of realized in COVID that exponential once it starts going, it's pretty going, if that makes sense. And I think we're now going through this really interesting situation through exponential change in tech. And actually so for me, it changes the kind of luck surface almost. So the ability for us to just try things which have huge combinatorial unlikeliness of happening. It means because we can chuck so much compute at the whole thing, we can do some really amazing things. And that really does excite me, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that kind of experimentation, and I feel like that's a human-ish trait. You know, obviously, you could build, a set of agents, a set of AI that's willing to experiment. Yeah. But it seems to me at the moment that tends to be a weakness. Like it gets quite good at perfecting too early on almost. And maybe that is also the kind of reason why stainless steel's type discovery happened so late, is that there's not really a willingness when you're perfecting something that's already quite valuable. Don't stray away from it.
How do you avoid being stuck in the local maxima? That's the the reality of it. And I think, like, it's interesting when I think of my career. So some of the most fun I had in my career were things when that feedback loop was at its shortest. So for example, I used to work about a gambling, like e-gaming. It's really good because you can get stuff live quickly. It's all really, really quick paced. And I think one of the things that we need to work out, it's going to be interesting as AI starts to move into large scale organizational direction, because the thing that we need to make sure is, one, that we're putting that feedback loop in, and two, that the thing that it's optimizing for is the thing you kind of really want to optimize for. Like, how do you, to your point, how do you avoid AI driving a local maxima that effectively maximizes short-term profits for a load of people, but destroys the 3, 5 year, 10-year horizon on a bunch of these companies? I think that's going to be really, really interesting to see effectively play out, which will end up with some massive losers and some massive winners, I suspect.
There is a whole theme there, because your kind of DevOps history, that's also been my history, actually. So I was with a core banking vendor for quite a long time, and building platforms, building technology, change promotion. It's all part of why those kinds of projects take a very long time. And then I think the kind of relevance to now and this conversation is A, the compute side of things, a little bit B, the kind of process. There's a whole ton of things. Actually, I'd love to ask you about, I love the Phoenix project, and I'm writing an article now about the book. I love it because it's described how organizations change and how they adopt things, and also it's a little bit cringy because you're like, oh, I know that character and I know that situation and I know sort of that hopeless feeling. So what's the link for you between cloud and DevOps and AI? Are they driving one another, or are they completely different disciplines?
So I think so I can definitely talk through it. So where do I think? So I think fundamentally it's been really interesting to see how cloud is changing the business model of just so many different things. Actually, I think that's one thing that I really do like. So if I look at so EC2 has a huge number of instances now, even more. I'd quote a stat, but I'd be wrong, quite honestly, because there'll probably be a new one.
What ballpark? I mean, it's one of those things. It's like it's hard to imagine how much compute there is. I gave this talk to a bunch of 5-6-year-olds at one point, and it's mind blowing for them that there's computers everywhere.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I mean, I want to say we're over 900,000 instances live. I think we're around that. We're a lot of different unique instances, which is kind of, there's one instance in all of it that's now it's been superseded, but it was kind of one of my favorites. There was a specific video transcoding instance that we had, and all it did, it was genuinely the best and the cheapest for transcoding H.265 streams, effectively multiple user. It was fantastic. And why did I think that was really interesting? Well, it was something that couldn't exist in other contexts, because each one of them was moderately expensive, was pretty expensive for us to build and put together. It had a low user take up, effectively. Like, people wouldn't need that many, or they'd need some, or need it for a bit, but not a huge amount of time. And so if you think how you'd build that in a traditional business, almost that friction of going out and selling them and getting them to people made it just impossible to. You couldn't have built a business without that. All of a sudden, as you can change the business model round, so people come to the infrastructure rather than the infrastructure coming to them, I think it means you can have far more specialization in really kind of interesting esoteric sides of things. And I think that's been real, and I think that's going to happen both in terms of, it's happened in terms of infrastructure and services, but it is that more and more it's that very specific service lens that's going to occur. It's that almost compartmentalization of things is super interesting.
I have a bit of an obsession at the moment, and I'm sure you've seen some of my LinkedIn posts. I think a lot of what we just discussed around computing and availability and scale, and actually like the friction to a process of obtaining it is, if you remove that stuff, demand kind of massively increases. And one of the things I talk about when I talk about pricing, when I'm kind of obsessed around pricing, is as a company, a software vendor, I think it's quite abnormal to try and lower pricing. Actually, so TransferWise is a customer who's trying to lower pricing, lower cost of moving money. That's sort of one of their fundamentals. And you think it just doesn't sound right. Like, from one perspective, you think a company like that wants to maximize profit. They want to charge more. But they're in a utility kind of business. They're in a business where people need more of it, should have access to more of it, and then will demand more of it. So, I think the challenge, AI on the horizon, the type of service demand, I see being a data-led utility, compute-led. These other sort of, there's going to be surrounding things that are driven by this central demand that everyone sees.
Yeah, and I think so. One of the things I genuinely like about working at Amazon AWS is some of the fundamentals of where our business models sit and how the economic drivers work. And it's always nice because you can always not believe people of their reason. Like, people can turn around, you can think people do stuff for whatever reason, and that's fine. But there's definitely a different thing when you can see the economic incentive that is driving that company to do things. I think it's far more like honest in a weird way. Effectively for us, I mean, we've lowered prices so many times, and kind of why have we done that? Well, the whole business model is that we want to try and make sure for customers that the individual cost of a widget, whatever that widget is, in terms of if that's data, if that's a service, if that's a product, we want to reduce the cost of those individual widgets. And we want to do that to effectively enable you to grow and to sell more of them or to produce more of them. And that is the business model, like no matter what else you do. And I think that's really good for me, because even the fact that we're a consumption-based business, I can go off today and I can convince someone to sign a bit of paper that says they're going to use X amount of AWS, or maybe I can't. I can ask them nicely to sign a bit of paper. You hope, exactly. But the reality is, unless they actually use it, unless they actually consume that, like, revenue is not being generated. And the only reason they're ever going to consume that is if it has benefit to them. And the only reason they're ever going to keep consuming that is if it has benefit to them in the future. So it's this really nice situation that we get into where we start to align economic incentives for everyone. And that's from the end consumer, the customer from us, AWS itself. And that's kind of where I think is really a job to. And I think that is a different business model from maybe some of the software. I used to buy a load of software off all kinds of different companies, of which I won't mention their names, and they would definitely.
Well, you referred them very early on, half jokingly, the kind of legacy. You actually used it as heritage.
The heritage.
I sort of feel that one of the reasons that software and technology becomes legacy is because they have not adapted. Have not adapted the way they work and the way they charge. I do feel very frustrated with enterprise type software sales processes. Then the outcomes are often far short of what this sort of promise was. They're just these huge beasts. Whereas the kind of much smaller incremental, the value exchange is much more real time in a kind of a utility or a small service.
This is what I love. I mean, I loved being in the world of DevOps. I really did. I thought, and I know it's now a thing that it's just accepted. So I totally get that. But I loved it at the time because there was something. It always reminded me of kind of like a drunk person trying to find a kebab shop after an evening out, where like the reality is, if you just keep walking one direction and you only look at your map and try and work out how you're finding your food, like once every 20 minutes or once every hour, you just end up really lost and you don't end up there. But if you constantly kind of check which way you're going, you kind of meander into the right path. And I think it's, the only thing that tells you really if your customers like your software is your customers using your software. Like that is it. There is nothing else. Everything else is just a proxy metric. And I think the fact that software delivery has changed so much in terms of that you can code it, it can be into, but I mean, I've not seen our recent stats, but it's millions of times a day AWS is deploying into prod. And I think that's been such an interesting thing. And again, I think that is something that the fact that you can blue-green deploy, the fact that, if I turn around and might think back into my data center days, like I wanted to deploy a whole nother production stack. Well, that's going to be a really challenging thing because
Yeah.
I've got to have a whole other production stack for the thing. Even if I need that thing for,
Whereas now business is normal, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the way you do things. And that's perhaps a good point to try and wrap up on. I love that analogy. You know, my kind of takeaway from hearing that is that think carefully about your destination. You do want to go to the kebab shop,
yeah,
but then check really often that you're on the right path to get there. And that just feels like a really good bit of advice for anyone listening. You know, whether they've got a big migration project, whether they've got something tiny to deliver, they've got AI demands coming down the pipe. Think carefully, and then just check really often.
yeah, no, exactly. And I think there's no substitute for that feedback loop that you can get through. The more that you get stuff into production, the more that you accept that it's going to fail sometimes, and the more you keep it going, the better. But
Yeah.
fantastic talking, actually.
Cool. Well, thank you, Jon. Thank you very much for coming on the show.